$230 million in seized drug money sat in front of me, neatly stacked in a federal evidence warehouse, and all I could think about was how my father would still call me a disappointment if he saw me standing here in my bulletproof vest, leading the task force that had just brought down one of the biggest money laundering operations in Texas history. The irony wasn't lost on me as I supervised my team cataloging the cash we'd seized from a mansion in Highland Park, Dallas's most exclusive neighborhood. Here I was, Nadia Miller, coordinating with the FBI, DEA, and Treasury Department on a case that would make national headlines. Yet to my family, I was still just the daughter who chose a boring government job instead of joining the family construction business. If only they knew that their precious Miller & Sons construction was drowning in debt, while I was swimming in confiscated millions that weren't mine to keep but were mine to protect. That morning's raid had been textbook perfect. My team moved through the 10,000-square-foot estate like shadows, securing room after room of evidence that would put the Sinaloa cartel's financial network out of business for years. As the lead financial crimes enforcement network analyst for the Southwest region, I'd spent 18 months tracking this money through shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts. The adrenaline still coursed through my veins as I watched agents load evidence boxes into armored trucks. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, Eleanor, reminding me about tonight's family dinner at the French Room in downtown Dallas. Another evening of listening to my father Richard complain about government regulations killing his business, my brother Ethan bragging about construction deals that never quite materialized, and my other brother Noah blaming bureaucrats for every problem in the industry. They had no idea that their baby sister, the one they constantly dismissed, had just helped coordinate the seizure of more money than their company had seen in its entire 40-year history. The drive from the federal building to the restaurant that evening felt like traveling between two different worlds. In one, I was Agent Miller, respected and feared by criminals across 5 states. In the other, I was just Nadia, the disappointment who wasted her Harvard education. Richard Miller sat at the head, naturally, his gray hair perfectly styled and his expression already sour as he scrolled through his phone, probably looking at more bad news about the company's finances. Eleanor noticed me first, her face brightening with that particular smile mothers reserve for their least favorite children when they're trying not to show it. She was wearing her usual Neiman Marcus ensemble, trying to project wealth the family no longer possessed. Ethan and Noah flanked my father like bodyguards, both in expensive suits that I knew they couldn't afford. As I sat down, Richard didn't even look up from his phone. His first words to me weren't a greeting, but a complaint about the IRS audit his company was facing. The waiter hadn't even brought the wine list before Noah launched into a tirade about environmental regulations destroying the construction industry. I sat there, quietly sipping water, knowing that the real reason Miller & Sons was failing had nothing to do with regulations, and everything to do with the fact that they'd been laundering money for a Mexican drug cartel for the past 3 years. I'd discovered it by accident 6 months ago, while reviewing suspicious activity reports for my job. A pattern of transactions involving construction companies in the Dallas-Fort Worth area had caught my attention, and when I dug deeper, I found my family's company right in the middle of it. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands were funneling money through Miller & Sons, using fake construction projects as cover. The invoices for non-existent renovations, the payments to subcontractors who didn't exist, the materials that were never delivered, but somehow cost millions of dollars. It was all there, in black and white. My first instinct had been to warn them, to somehow extract my family from this mess before it destroyed them. But every gentle attempt to steer conversation toward the company's finances was met with condescension. When I suggested they might want to review their client vetting process, Noah had actually laughed in my face, telling me to stick to pushing papers and leave real business to the men. When I mentioned that some construction companies were unknowingly being used for money laundering, my father had patted my hand like I was a child and said government paranoia was why America couldn't build anything anymore. She'd been helping me move apartments the previous weekend, a rare moment of maternal attention that I should have been suspicious of. While I was in the bathroom, she'd apparently gone through my mail and found a statement from my Federal Credit Union account. Not my personal account, but the operational account I managed for seized assets awaiting judicial disposition. The account that currently held $230,000 in drug money, pending the conclusion of a case. Richard's eyes lit up like a child on Christmas morning when Eleanor mentioned the balance. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at me, studying my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to explain that it wasn't my money, that it was a federal evidence account, but he wasn't listening. All he heard was that his daughter had access to exactly the amount he needed to save Miller & Sons from bankruptcy. The rest of the dinner became a coordinated assault on my conscience. Eleanor talked about all the sacrifices they'd made to send me to Harvard, how disappointed my grandmother would be to see the family business fail. Ethan reminded me of every birthday gift, every Christmas present, every time they'd included me, despite my choices. Noah was less subtle, calling me selfish and ungrateful, saying I was the kind of person who would watch her family drown while sitting on a life preserver. I left that dinner feeling sick to my stomach. Not from the overpriced food, but from the realization that my family saw me not as a person, but as a resource to be exploited. They didn't care about my career, my accomplishments, or my happiness. They cared about what I could do for them, and now that they thought I had money, I was suddenly worth their attention. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure campaign intensified. Eleanor called me crying about the shame of bankruptcy, how their friends at the country club would abandon them. Ethan texted me articles about families torn apart by financial hardship, always with passive-aggressive comments about how some people could prevent such tragedies. Noah was the worst, showing up at my office unannounced, making scenes in front of my colleagues, demanding to know why I valued my job over my family. The breaking point came when he used terms like fiduciary responsibility and constructive trust, throwing around legal jargon like confetti at a parade for idiots. Richard hung on every word, nodding along as Wolfgang painted a picture of government overreach and family rights. When Wolfgang suggested that accessing the funds would be a simple matter of asserting familial claim, I knew I had to speak up. I explained, as clearly and calmly as I could, that the account wasn't a trust fund. It was a federal evidence account containing seized criminal assets. The money belonged to the United States government, held pending judicial proceedings. Accessing it wouldn't just be illegal. It would be multiple federal felonies including theft of government property, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Each charge carried years in federal prison. Richard's response still echoes in my mind. He laughed, actually laughed, and told me I'd been brainwashed by my government handlers. He said the bureaucrats had convinced me to be their guard dog, protecting their slush fund while my own family suffered. Eleanor added that a good daughter would find a way to help, that family should come first, always. Noah called me a coward, said I was hiding behind regulations because I didn't have the guts to stand up for what mattered. I gave them one last warning. Standing in Wolfgang's shabby office, surrounded by fake law books and motivational posters, I told them exactly what would happen if they proceeded. I explained how federal prosecutors would treat this case, how the FBI would investigate, how their entire lives would be torn apart looking for evidence of conspiracy. I begged them to walk away, to find another solution, to declare bankruptcy if necessary, but to stay on the right side of the law. They didn't listen. 3 days later, while I was in Austin for a conference, they did it. Using information Eleanor had stolen from my apartment, including my Social Security number and federal employee ID number, Wolfgang helped Richard access the evidence account. They withdrew all $230. I hung up the phone and sat in my empty apartment for exactly 5 minutes, allowing myself that small window to mourn the family I'd never really had. Then I went to work. Not the conflicted, guilty work of a daughter trying to protect criminal parents, but the cold, methodical work of a federal agent who'd just witnessed the theft of government assets. The first call was to my supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Patricia Chen. I reported the theft immediately, providing all documentation and identifying all parties involved. Patricia had known about my family situation, had even offered to recuse me from any cases that might involve them. Now she listened as I laid out the evidence against them, my voice steady and professional. The second call was to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The agent who answered recognized my name from the Highland Park raid, treated me with the respect my family never had. I provided him with Wolfgang's information, the fraudulent documents he'd prepared, and the electronic trail of the stolen funds. He assured me the case would be prioritized given the amount involved and the breach of a federal evidence account. The third call was to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. This one was personal. I knew about Miller and Son's involvement with the cartel, had kept quiet, hoping they'd extricate themselves. But now, with them having crossed this line, I held nothing back. I provided 18 months of suspicious activity reports, shell company documentation, and evidence of structured transactions designed to evade reporting requirements. The fourth call was to my contact at the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control. The cartels Miller and Sons had been working with were under international sanctions. Every transaction my family's company had processed for them was a violation of federal law, each carrying potential penalties in the millions of dollars. By sunrise, I'd sent encrypted files to law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. The web of corruption my family had entangled themselves in stretched from Dallas to Sinaloa, and I made sure every thread would be pulled. This wasn't revenge, I told myself, as I watched the sun rise over the Dallas. I listened to it all with the phone on speaker while I filled out paperwork for a new case. When Richard finally ran out of breath, I spoke. I told him I was not his daughter anymore. I was Agent Miller, and he was a federal suspect who'd stolen government assets and laundered money for drug cartels. I informed him that anything he said could be used against him in court, and that he should contact a real lawyer, not a strip mall con artist. Then I hung up and blocked the number. The investigation that followed revealed more than even I had suspected. Miller and Sons hadn't just been laundering money. They'd been actively facilitating drug trafficking. The non-existent construction projects were cover for tunnel systems between safe houses. The phantom workers were cartel members being paid through seemingly legitimate channels. What I'd thought was simple financial crime was actually a cornerstone of a major trafficking operation. Ethan cracked first, trying to cut a deal by testifying against Richard and Noah. He claimed he'd been forced into it, that he'd wanted out but was threatened. The prosecutors didn't buy it. His signature was on too many documents, his accounts had received too much money. Noah tried to blame me, actually told investigators that I'd orchestrated everything as revenge for childhood slights. That lasted until they showed him the evidence I'd compiled, dating back long before our family conflict. Eleanor was the only one who escaped criminal charges, though not unscathed. She'd been willfully blind to the crime but not an active participant. Still, she lost everything. The house in Highland Park, the country club membership, the Mercedes, the jewelry. All of it seized as proceeds of crime. The last time I saw her was at Richard's sentencing. The federal courthouse in Dallas had never felt smaller than it did that day. I sat in the gallery, not as a family member but as a government witness. Richard looked older, grayer, diminished in his orange jumpsuit. When the judge read the charges, conspiracy to commit money laundering, theft of government property, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, the list seemed endless. Each guilty verdict hit him like a physical blow. Every warning I'd given had been ignored. Every attempt to protect them had been met with contempt. They'd committed crimes not out of desperation, but out of arrogance, believing they were above the law. I hadn't destroyed the family. I'd simply held them accountable for their choices. She called me heartless, said I was no daughter of hers. I agreed with her. I was no daughter of hers. I was Agent Nadia Miller, and I'd done my job. The aftermath was quieter than I'd expected. The media coverage was intense for a few weeks, focusing on the family drama aspect of the case. My colleagues at FinCEN treated me with a mixture of respect and caution, unsure how to interact with someone who'd sent their own family to federal prison. Some whispered that I was cold, ruthless. Others said I had integrity they could only aspire to. Patricia Chen, my supervisor, understood better than most. She'd come from a family that had wanted her to look the other way, to use her position for their benefit. She knew the weight of choosing duty over blood, justice over family. She recommended me for a promotion, not as a reward, but as recognition that I'd proven myself capable of making the hardest decisions. I accepted a position in Washington, D.C., leading a new task force focused on cartel financial networks. It meant leaving Dallas, leaving Texas, leaving behind any possibility of reconciliation with whatever remained of my family. But it also meant doing work that mattered, saving lives by cutting off the money that funded violence and addiction. My new apartment in Georgetown was smaller than my place in Dallas, but felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived before. I decorated it with my own choices, not hand-me-downs from family or pieces chosen to meet their approval. Every morning I walked to work along the Potomac, watching the sunrise over the Capitol, reminding myself that I'd chosen this life. The work was challenging, complex, important. We tracked money through systems designed to hide it, followed trails that led from American banks to cartel strongholds. Every seizure, every arrest, every conviction was a victory not just for law enforcement. The relationship he mourned had never existed. He'd never seen me as a daughter but as a resource, valued only when I could provide something. His imprisonment hadn't changed that, had only removed his ability to exploit me. Eleanor sent letters too, filled with guilt and manipulation in equal measure. She wrote about being alone, abandoned, struggling to survive on Social Security. She reminded me of birthdays, holidays, moments she'd manufactured into false memories of maternal love. She asked for money, just a little help, just until she got back on her feet. I forwarded her letters to social services, ensuring she received information about food banks, shelter services, support programs. But I sent nothing personally. No money, no words, no acknowledgement. Ethan tried to call from prison, but I'd blocked the federal inmate phone system from reaching me. Noah sent angry letters through his lawyer, threatening civil suits for emotional distress, alienation of affection, destruction of family business. The lawyer, a court-appointed public defender, clearly knew the threats were baseless but had to forward them anyway. I kept the letters as evidence of continued harassment, just in case. The only family member I maintained any contact with was my cousin Sarah, who'd moved to Seattle years before the family business turned criminal. She'd watched from afar as everything unfolded, understanding why I'd done what I did. She told me about family reactions, about relatives who called me a traitor, and others who whispered that Richard had it coming. She was my only link to a past I no longer claimed, and even that connection was tenuous. My work in D.C. expanded, taking on international dimensions. I testified before Congress about cartel financial networks, helped draft legislation to close money laundering loopholes, trained other agents in financial investigation techniques. The girl who'd been dismissed as a paper pusher was now shaping national policy on financial crime. Every success felt like vindication, proof that I'd chosen correctly. 2 years after the arrests, I was part of the team that took down the entire financial structure of the cartel my family had served. The family business they'd killed themselves to save would be forgotten in a generation. The work I did would save lives for decades. Sometimes, late at night in my Georgetown apartment, I'd think about the life I might have had. If they'd been different people, if they'd chosen different paths, if they'd seen me as more than their least valuable asset. But those thoughts were brief, fleeting, overwhelmed by the reality of the life I'd built. I had colleagues who respected me, work that mattered, a purpose beyond personal gain. I dated occasionally, carefully, always transparent about my past when things grew serious. Some men were intrigued by the drama, attracted to what they saw as dangerous determination. Others were repelled, unable to imagine choosing duty over family. I learned to recognize both as wrong for me, seeking instead those who understood that integrity isn't about choosing easy paths, but right ones. 3 years after the arrests, I stood on the rooftop terrace of the Department of Justice, looking out over Washington as the city lights flickered to life. I'd just been promoted to Deputy Director of Financial Intelligence, the youngest person ever to hold the position. My phone buzzed with congratulations from colleagues, mentors, friends who'd become my chosen family. Not one message came from Dallas, from anyone named Miller, from the life I'd left behind. I thought about Ethan, Noah, and Richard in their cells, perhaps playing cards or watching television, marking time until release dates that seemed impossibly distant. I thought about Eleanor, living in a small apartment in a forgotten corner of Dallas, surrounded by memories of grandeur that had always been built on crime. I thought about Wolfgang, disgraced and disbarred, probably running some new scam from some new strip mall. They'd all made their choices, and I'd made mine. They'd chosen crime, greed, arrogance, and a willingness to destroy others for personal gain. I'd chosen law, justice, service, and the harder path of holding even those closest to me accountable. I am exactly who I chose to be, and that choice, that absolute refusal to compromise my integrity for anyone or anything, is my greatest accomplishment. The family that raised me is in prison or poverty, brought down by their own crimes and their assumption that I would enable them. The family I've built, my colleagues and the citizens I protect, trust me absolutely because I've proven that my integrity has no price. Richard thought he was saving his legacy by stealing that money. He was right, in a way. He did save his legacy, just not how he intended. His legacy is me, the daughter who refused to be corrupted, who chose justice over blood, who proved that no one is above the law. I don't visit them in prison. I don't send money to Eleanor. I don't respond to letters or calls or messages passed through relatives. Not because I'm cruel, but because there's nothing to say. They are criminals who happen to share my DNA, and I am the agent who held them accountable. That's the entire relationship, stripped of sentiment and manipulation and false obligation. My story isn't one of revenge or hatred. It's one of clarity, of seeing people for who they truly are and responding accordingly. My family showed me who they were through every dismissive comment, every sexist assumption, every moment they valued me only for what I could provide. When they committed federal crimes and expected me to enable them, they simply confirmed what I'd always known. They were never my family in any way that mattered. Standing on that rooftop, promoted and respected and free, I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, but no regret either. They'd authored their own destruction through choices they'd made freely and repeatedly, despite clear warnings. I'd simply refused to be destroyed alongside them. In their minds, that made me a traitor. In mine, it made me exactly who I'd always been, just finally free to show it. The city lights stretched to the horizon, millions of people living their lives, most never knowing